Thomas Keene noticed the snow first. He had been walking the hollow since before first light, the same route he walked on the mornings after heavy snowfall, checking the traps along the upper creek, assessing the new depth, reading the overnight record that fresh snow kept of whatever had moved through the hollow while he slept. 3 feet of snow had fallen between sunset and the small hours, the kind of overnight accumulation that the narrow hollows of the Ozark ridges caught and held, the terrain funneling the weather and the cold into the low ground where the settlement sat. By the time Thomas reached the upper end of the hollow, the snow was at his thighs in the drifted sections and knee-deep in the open, and the morning light was coming over the east ridge and catching the surface in the specific way that new snow caught early light. Sharp and clean and undisturbed, every surface a record of the night's stillness. The snow around Isaac Mercer's cabin was perfect. This was what Thomas noticed first, before the door, before the absence of smoke from the chimney, before any of the things he would later name as wrongness. He noticed the snow the way a man who read snow for a living noticed it, with the automatic attention of someone for whom the surface of fresh ground was information. He had been reading snow since he was 14 years old, in Tennessee and then in the Ozarks, and he knew what undisturbed snow looked like, and he knew what it meant about the hours before he arrived. The snow around Mercer's cabin was undisturbed in every direction, at the woodpile, at the path between the cabin and the creek, at the gap between the cabin's east wall and the first line of timber 40 yards out. Every surface clean, every angle of early light showing him the unmarked white that meant nothing had moved here since the snow stopped falling. He stopped on the path and looked at the cabin. Something was wrong with the picture of it. He stood still and let his attention move over the scene the way he moved it over fresh ground when he was reading it, not looking for anything specific, looking at everything, letting the wrongness locate itself rather than going toward it. The woodpile was undisturbed, the split quarters stacked under the overhang where Mercer always kept them. The window on the south wall was shuttered for winter, as it should be. The chimney showed no smoke, which was wrong. It was full day, and Mercer had a fire every morning. But a cold chimney could mean a man who had overslept, a man who had been unwell, a man whose fire had gone out in the night. A cold chimney was not by itself alarming. Then he saw the door. It was standing open. Not ajar, open, the full width of the door's swing, the interior of the cabin dark against the white of the morning. The door itself was clean on its outer face, the snow that had drifted against the cabin's front wall not disturbed, the snow on the stoop below, the threshold not disturbed, the 3 feet of accumulated snow between the stoop and the tree line not disturbed. The door was open, and the snow was perfect, and Thomas Keene stood in the hollow and looked at both of these things and did not, for a long moment, move. He called, "Mercer." His voice went into the hollow, and the hollow gave it back diminished, the way voices came back in deep snow, absorbed at the edges. No answer from the cabin. No movement. He called again. Nothing. He walked to the cabin door through the snow, his own tracks the first marks in the surface between the trail and the threshold, and he stood at the open door and looked in. Isaac Mercer had come to the hollow in 1843, 3 years before the winter that took him. He had come alone, which was unusual, but not unknown in the Ozark settlement years. A man with a reason to start elsewhere or a reason to stop somewhere, finding himself in a hollow that had room for one more cabin and putting one up. He was in his middle 40s, a compact and deliberate man who spoke carefully and who kept his own company without being unfriendly about it. He trapped the North Creek drainage, and he traded his pelts at the post 12 miles south, and he was present at the settlement's common occasions without being central to them. He had been good with his hands in the way of men who lived alone and had to be. The cabin he built in his first autumn in the hollow was tight and well-fitted, better than some cabins that had been built by two men working together. He had a habit of reading in the evenings, which was noted in the settlement because books were not common in the hollow, and a man who had books and read them had a specific quality that the settlement respected without quite sharing. He had 3 books that Thomas knew of: a Bible, a natural history volume of some kind, and a third that Thomas had never identified. The books were still in the cabin when they searched it. Everything that was Mercer's was still in the cabin. Thomas Keene knew him the way you knew a neighbor in a small and isolated settlement. Well enough to rely on, not so well as to be without surprises. They had trapped adjacent drainages for 3 years and had shared the specific companionship of men who worked the same kind of ground in similar ways, the companionship that required few words because the work provided its own language. Thomas had been in the cabin twice. Once when Mercer had a winter fever and Thomas had brought broth that Eleanor Doyle sent. Once when they were sorting a trapping dispute about a creek boundary that they settled in 10 minutes over coffee and never mentioned again. He knew the layout of the cabin, the single room, the fireplace on the north wall, the sleeping area partitioned by a hanging blanket, the rifle on its pegs above the door, the table, and the 2 chairs. The cabin interior was as he knew it, mostly. The fire had burned out. The hearth, cold, the ash settled in the way ash settled when a fire had been left to die rather than banked for the night. This was the first wrongness Thomas named specifically. Mercer banked his fire at night, as anyone who lived alone in an Ozark winter banked their fire. You did not go to sleep in January with an unbanked fire in a single-room cabin that was your only heat. You banked it, or you froze. Mercer knew this. The ash in the hearth said the fire had been left, not banked, left in the specific way of a fire that had been burning and had been abandoned rather than tended down. One of the 2 chairs was on its side on the floor. The rifle was on its pegs above the door. This was the second thing Thomas named. Mercer's rifle went with Mercer everywhere outside the cabin, the way any man's rifle went with him everywhere outside the cabin in that country in 1846. It was not a decorative object or a spare. It was the tool that a man in that hollow needed in the same way he needed his boots, which were also present. Both boots, set together at the side of the sleeping area in the position of boots that had been removed before bed, the specific position of footwear that had been placed rather than kicked off. The boots of a man who had gone to sleep. Thomas stood in the cabin door and looked at the cold hearth and the overturned chair and the rifle on its pegs and the boots placed neatly beside the sleeping area, and he felt the account he was assembling failing to close in a way that was distinct from the ordinary failure of incomplete information. This was not incomplete information. This was complete information that did not add up. He stepped inside and looked at the sleeping area. The blanket was pulled back as though someone had risen from it. The straw tick beneath showed the compressed impression of a person who had been sleeping there. Mercer had been in bed. Mercer had gotten up. Mercer had gotten up and left the fire to go out and knocked over a chair and opened the door and gone somewhere without his boots and without his rifle and without leaving any mark in 3 feet of new snow. Thomas stood in the cold cabin and held all of this. Then he went to get the others. The hollow in January of 1846 held 5 families, which meant 5 cabins and 18 people, which meant that the settlement's full investigative capacity was limited by its size, but was not limited in its attention. What it lacked in numbers, it supplied in the specific concentration of people, for whom the hollow was the whole of their world in winter, who had no other business, no other place to be, for whom the mystery of a neighbor's disappearance was not an interruption of life, but the whole content of the days that followed it. They assembled at Mercer's cabin within the hour, the Doyle family from the south end of the hollow, Matthew and Eleanor, and their grown son Will, the Perrys from the cabin nearest the creek. Old Silas Croft, who lived alone in the easternmost cabin and who moved slowly in the cold, but who came anyway. Thomas had knocked on each door in turn and said the same thing at each. "Mercer's gone. Come look." What they found when they looked was what Thomas had found, and they found it with the systematic attention of people who needed to understand it. They examined the snow in expanding circles outward from the cabin, the way you examined snow when you were looking for tracks, from the threshold outward, checking every angle, the full perimeter of the clearing, and into the first timber on 3 sides. Matthew Doyle and his son Will worked the north perimeter, where the timber came closest to the cabin. Perry and Thomas worked the east and west sides. Silas Croft stood at the door and looked at the snow between the cabin and the creek trail, and said quietly that there was nothing on the south side either. They completed the perimeter in 40 minutes. There were no tracks. Not Mercer's tracks, not animal tracks, not any disturbance in the snow's surface that could have been a track obscured by drift or wind. The snow around the cabin was as Thomas had found it on his first approach, perfect, unbroken, the overnight accumulation undisturbed in every direction out to the timber and beyond. One set of tracks in the entire clearing, Thomas's own approach to the door. Will Doyle said, "The snow stopped falling around 3 in the morning. He said, "I was awake, the wind woke me, and the snow had stopped by 3. He said, "Anything that moved after 3 would have left tracks. Anything that moved before 3 would have been covered." Perry said, "So he disappeared during the snow, before 3. Will said, "If he walked." The group was quiet. Perry said, "If he walked." Matthew Doyle had not spoken since he arrived. He was 61 years old, and he had been in the Ozark Ridge country since 1829. 17 years, long enough to have been in the hollow, when it was not a settlement, when it was simply a hollow that he had moved through on his way to somewhere, and had decided was the somewhere he had been moving toward. He had seen the hollow in every configuration that 17 years provided. He stood at the door of Mercer's cabin and looked at the interior, and then he looked at the snow, and then he looked at the interior again, and his face had the quality of a face that was recognizing something. Thomas noticed this. He said, "Matthew." Doyle said, "Let me think." He went inside and stood in the cold cabin for a while by himself. The others waited outside. When he came back out, he had the quality of a man who had confirmed something he had come in expecting to find. He said, "The latch." Thomas said, "What about it?" Doyle said, "Go look at the latch." The latch on Mercer's cabin door was the interior bar, the simple wooden bar that dropped into the iron bracket on the door frame, the mechanism that every cabin in the hollow used to secure the door from inside. It was the standard door security of the frontier, adequate for the purpose, the bar heavy enough that it could not be lifted from outside without a tool and a gap. The bar was broken. Not the bracket. The bar itself snapped near the center, the 2 halves still in their positions, the break clean in the way of green wood that had been subjected to sudden force rather than slow stress. The bar had been broken by something pressing against it. Not from outside. The break geometry was wrong for outside pressure. The wood fractured in the direction of force that came from the door being pushed outward. The bar resisting outward force and failing under it. The door had been pushed open from the inside, hard enough to break the bar. Will Doyle said, so he broke it himself. He wanted out fast. Thomas said, fast enough to break the bar instead of lifting it. Will said, if he was frightened. Thomas said, frightened of what? He was inside with the door barred. Eleanor Doyle, who had come into the cabin and was standing near the fireplace, said, look at the ash. They looked. The fireplace ash was disturbed. Not in the way of ash disturbed by a poker or a shovel, the ordinary disturbance of tending a fire. Disturbed from the front, from the direction of the room, as though something had moved the ash from outside the fireplace without a tool. A displacement pattern in the ash that went outward from the hearth in an arc, as though something had passed close to the fire and moved the ash in passing. Eleanor said, something moved through the room. Will said, Mercer moved through the room. She said, Mercer moved through the room and disturbed the ash without touching the fire and knocked over the chair and broke the latch and went out the door. She said, all of that without his boots and without his rifle. She said, I'm trying to understand what he was doing. No one answered her. Thomas was standing at the door looking at the interior latch, and then at the snow outside, and then back at the latch, holding the sequence that the physical evidence described. Something in the room. The ash displaced, the chair overturned, the bar broken from inside, the door open. A man who had been asleep and had gotten up and had left with more urgency than a man leaving voluntarily in the middle of a winter night would leave. A man who had left without the things a man took. He thought, a man frightened out of his own cabin in the night goes somewhere. He runs to a neighbor. He runs to cover. He runs, and running in 3 feet of snow leaves tracks, and the snow has no tracks. He thought, a man does not run without his boots. He thought, these two things together mean something I do not have a name for. He stood at the door and did not say any of this. The settlement spent 2 days at the question, and the question did not move. They searched the hollow, both drainage, arms above the settlement and the creek bottom, below it for a mile south. The timber on both ridge flanks to the height that could be reached in the snow. They searched in pairs systematically, the way people searched who knew the terrain and who were looking for a man rather than for a thing. They found nothing. No Mercer, no tracks, no evidence that a person had passed through any part of the hollow since the snowfall. The snow was 3 feet deep and unmarked, and it stayed unmarked for 2 full days while the temperature held below freezing and no new snow fell to complicate the record. The settlement returned to Mercer's cabin on the afternoon of the first day and went through it again, more carefully, with the attention of people who had had several hours to think about what they were looking for. Eleanor Doyle examined the sleeping area in the specific way she examined things, slowly, without touching, before touching, reading the surface before disturbing it. She reported that the blanket had been moved back from the sleeping position in a single motion, not the gradual displacement of a person who had turned in their sleep or shifted during the night. Moved back deliberately. The straw tick beneath showed the long impression of a person who had been lying in their ordinary sleeping position. She said, he got up the way a person got up when they had a reason to get up, not slowly. Perry had brought his wife, who was quiet and observant in the way of the settlement's most observant people, and she stood in the center of the room and looked at the overturned chair and at the ash disturbance, and said something that the settlement sat with. The room looks like someone left in a hurry, she said. Everything about it looks like hurry. The fire not banked, the chair knocked, the latch broken rather than lifted. She said, but his boots are placed. His boots are placed the way a person places them who has no hurry in them. The room was quiet. Will Doyle said, "So he went to sleep without hurry, and then he woke up with it." Perry's wife said, "Yes, that's what the room says." Thomas had been standing at the door listening to this, and he said, "What woke him?" Nobody answered. He said, "The fire. The fire went out." He said, "A cold cabin wakes you in the night. The temperature drops and you wake and you bank the fire." He said, "Mercer would have woken from the cold and gone to the fire." Eleanor said, "And then?" Thomas said, "And then whatever happened between the fire and the door." He looked at the ash disturbance and the overturned chair and the broken latch and the open door and the perfect snow. And the sequence was there, and the sequence had a gap in it that was the size of everything that mattered. The settlement moved through those 2 days with the specific quality of people who were trying to act normally within an abnormal situation, doing the day's necessary work, feeding the animals, managing the cold, going through the motions of ordinary winter life, while the question of the open door and the perfect snow sat at the center of everything, like an object in a room that everyone was walking around. Conversations were shorter than usual. The children in the Perry household were quieter than usual. Perry noticed this and did not address it, because he did not know what he would say. Silas Croft came to each cabin in turn on the second afternoon, moving slowly between them in the cold, and he sat with each family for a while and said little and listened to whatever was being said. He was 73 years old, and he had been in the ridge country since before any of them. In the years before the hollow was a settlement, when it was simply terrain he passed through on his way to other terrain. He had seen things in those years that he did not talk about, in the way of old men who had decided that certain experiences were better held than shared. He listened to the settlement's various attempts to account for what had happened to Mercer, and he nodded and he said at the Perry table, "It will go into the hollow." He said it simply as a statement of how things worked rather than as comfort or conclusion. He said, "Things that happen here go into the hollow, and the hollow holds them, and most of them don't come back out." He said, "Mercer is in the hollow now." Perry's wife said, "Is that supposed to help?" Silas said, "It's supposed to be true." The dogs would not approach the cabin. This was something each family's dogs demonstrated independently. Not brought to the cabin, not tested, just observed when they were out and were in the cabin's vicinity. The Perry dog turned back 100 yards from the cabin and would not be urged closer. The Doyle dog sat at the edge of the Doyle property and faced north toward the Mercer cabin and would not cross whatever line it had established. Thomas's own dog, a big mixed hound named Ress, who had worked the hollow with him for 5 years and who was not a timid animal, would come within 50 yards of the cabin and then stop and stand with her fur raised along the spine and would not go further. Thomas tried once, on the first day, to bring Ress close enough to work, to let the dog do what dogs could do, which was find things that men couldn't find. He brought her to the 50-yard mark, and she stopped, and he urged her, and she held the line she had set for herself, and he stopped urging because he understood, after a career of working with dogs in the field, that an animal who had decided something this completely had information that was worth more than your instruction. He walked back with her and let her go. On the second evening, Thomas sat with Matthew Doyle at the Doyle table, while Eleanor moved around the cabin at its winter tasks, and Will sat near the fire with his pipe. They had been talking about the search in the way the settlement had been talking about it for 2 days, going over the evidence, the absence of tracks, the broken latch, the boots, the rifle, and the conversation had arrived at the place where it always arrived, which was the absence of any account that held all of the evidence honestly. Thomas said, "What were you looking for in the cabin when you went in alone?" Doyle was quiet for a moment. He said, "I wanted to see if it was the same." Thomas said, "The same as what?" Doyle said, "There was a trapper. Before your time here, before most people's time in this hollow. Farther up the north drainage, where the creek bends before the ridge." He said, "I was in this hollow then." 1831. He said, "We found his cabin the same way. Door open. Snow undisturbed." Thomas said, "What happened to him?" Doyle said, "We never found him." He said, "No tracks, no sign, nothing in the timber." He said, "We searched, and then the next snow came and covered everything, and that was the end of the search." He said, "The latch was the same, broken from inside." Thomas said, "You're certain?" Doyle said, "I went in alone that morning, the same way I went in alone today." He said, "I was 30 years younger, and it was the first time I'd seen anything like it, and I stood in that cabin and looked at the latch, and felt what I felt today when I looked at Mercer's latch." He said, "Recognition. Not of the thing itself, but of the pattern of it. The same pattern and the same evidence, 15 years apart." He said, "The man in 1831 was named Cole. Robert Cole, a trapper out of Missouri who had come down into the ridge country following the game. He'd been in the hollow about a year." He said, "We searched for a week and found nothing, and then we stopped searching because there was nothing left to find." He said, "I've thought about Cole for 15 years, and about what happened in that cabin, and I've made my peace with not knowing." He paused, or what I thought was peace, and then this morning I walked up to Mercer's door. Thomas said, "Did Cole's cabin show anything else? Anything beyond the door and the latch?" Doyle said, "The fire was cold. The rifle was on the wall." He said, "I don't remember about boots. I was young, and I didn't know to look at everything the way you'd look now. I was looking for Cole, and when Cole wasn't there, I didn't look as carefully at the rest." He said, "I've wished I'd looked more carefully." He said, "What I remember is the snow. Standing outside that cabin in 1831 and looking at the perfect snow and understanding that the perfection of it was information, not just the absence of information." He said, "The snow telling you nothing is the snow telling you something." He said, "I've thought about that for 15 years. What it meant that a man disappeared and the snow showed nothing. Not just no tracks, nothing, not even wind sign or animal sign. Everything around that cabin as untouched as if the hollow had held its breath all night." He said, "I think it did." He said, "I think whatever happens on those nights, those specific winter nights with fresh, deep snow and the hollow quiet and a man alone in a barred cabin, I think the hollow holds its breath for it." He said, "And the snow in the morning is the record of the holding." Thomas said nothing. Doyle said, 15 years. He said, "I haven't thought about it much in 15 years. And then I walked up to Mercer's door this morning, and the snow was the same, and the door was the same." He said, "You want to know what I think?" Thomas said, "Yes." Doyle said, "I think Mercer opened the door." He said, "I don't think Mercer was taken through the door or pushed through the door. I think he broke the latch and opened the door and went out, or let something in." He said, "The evidence doesn't tell me which one, but those are the two things an open door means." Thomas said, "No tracks going out." Doyle said, "No tracks going out." Thomas said, "So he let something in." Doyle was quiet. He looked at the fire. He said, Snow hides more than tracks. He said it in the specific way of a man quoting something or remembering something, not in the way of a man constructing an argument. A statement about the world that he had arrived at from a long experience of the world. He said, "What I've thought about it across the years is this." He paused. There are things in the old hollow country that the snow shows you, and things it doesn't show you. Tracks are what the snow shows you. He said, "What doesn't leave tracks doesn't announce itself in the snow." He said, "If a man in a barred cabin breaks the bar from inside and opens his door in the night, he opened it for a reason." He said, "The reason may not be visible in the snow." He said, "I think both of them, the man in 1831 and Mercer, heard something." He said, "I think they heard something that they opened their doors for." He said, "What they heard and what they opened their doors to is what I've thought about for 15 years and what I will think about for whatever years remain." He said, "I'm not going to tell you what I think it was." Eleanor had stopped moving around the cabin while her husband was talking. She was standing near the window, not looking out of it, just standing. When Doyle finished, she said without turning, "I think that's right," she said. "I think they opened their doors." The fire burned. Outside the cabin, the hollow was silent in the specific silence of deep winter, the 3 feet of snow damping everything to near nothing, the cold pressing on the cabin walls with the weight of a January night in the Ozark ridges. Thomas sat at the table and held what Doyle had said and did not speak for a while. On the 3rd day, the wind came. Not a storm, just the wind that came. After deep snow events in the Ozark Hollow country, the secondary weather that followed a major accumulation as the pressure systems reorganized and the ridges began to funnel the new air down into the low ground. The wind moved the surface snow in the fine, loose drift that wind moved new snow in, shifting the upper layer without disturbing the base, redistributing the overnight surface rather than erasing it. The wind moved the drifts around Mercer's cabin. It was Will Doyle who went to look first, in the early afternoon when the wind had been running for several hours, going to look because the snow movement near the cabin had been at the back of everyone's thinking since the first day. The awareness that whatever record the snow held was a temporary record, that weather would eventually take it. He went to see what the wind had revealed before it took the rest. He came back in 20 minutes and said, "There are tracks." The settlement went to look. The tracks had been uncovered by the wind's movement of the surface drift, revealed rather than made, the drift layer removed to expose what was in the compacted snow beneath. They came from the north, from the direction of the timber on the ridge flank, moving south through the clearing toward the cabin door in a line that was direct and without hesitation. Not the wandering approach of an animal working a scent, not the angled path of a person uncertain of direction. Direct, purposeful. They were not Mercer's. This was determinable because the settlement knew Mercer's boot size, and because Thomas had seen the boots in the cabin, and because the impressions in the compacted snow were larger than boot prints and shaped differently. Not the flat rectangle of a boot sole, but something broader, with a quality to the impression's edge that no one who looked at it attempted to describe precisely. They looked at the impressions, and each person arrived at the limit of their vocabulary at approximately the same point, which was the point at which description required naming the thing that had made the impression, and no one had a name they were willing to commit to. Thomas crouched over one of the clearer impressions in the middle section of the track and looked at it for a long time. He had been reading tracks in this country for 15 years. He read them the way he read everything, without rushing toward a conclusion before the evidence required one, letting what was there be what it was before deciding what it meant. He looked at the impression, and he let it be what it was. He stood up. Perry said, "What is it?" Thomas said, "I don't know." He said it in the flat, specific way of a man who was not hedging, who meant exactly what he said. He said, "I've tracked everything in this hollow country. I don't know what made this." He said, "The stride is what it is." He said, "Look at the distance between impressions." He pointed. Longer than a man's stride. Regular. Not the irregular stride of an animal moving through snow. Regular. The way something moved that was accustomed to moving through snow and whose movement was not impeded by it. Will Doyle said, "It came straight from the timber." Thomas said, "Straight. No deviation." He said, "It knew where it was going." The tracks came from the timber to the cabin door. They stopped at the threshold. Not entered. Stopped. The last impression was at the base of the door frame, at the point where the stoop met the snow on the outside. Whatever had made the tracks had come from the timber to the door and had stopped, there, at the place where the open door would have been when Mercer opened it, standing at the threshold in the space between outside and inside. Thomas stood at the threshold and looked at the last impression, and then looked back along the line of tracks to the timber's edge and thought about Doyle's words. About a man in a barred cabin hearing something and opening the door. About the two possibilities an open door presented. He thought, the tracks came to the door and stopped. He thought, the door was open when I found it. He thought, the door being open and the tracks stopping at the threshold are consistent with what Doyle said. They are consistent with Mercer opening the door and whatever made these tracks entering, and with whatever entered leaving no tracks because it did not go out through the snow. He thought, that is a complete account of the evidence. He thought, a complete account of the evidence is not the same as a true account. He stood at the threshold and the settlement stood around him, and no one spoke for a while. Silas Croft, who had been slow in getting to the cabin and who had arrived last, and who stood at the back of the group with the patient attention of an old man who had learned not to hurry toward conclusions, said, "Where do they go back?" Everyone looked at him. He said, "Where are the tracks going back? They came from the timber. They need to go back." The group turned and looked at the line of tracks from the threshold to the timber's edge. One line, coming in, no returning line alongside it. They fanned out along the timber's edge, looking for a return track in either direction. They went 50 yards north and 50 yards south along the tree line, and found nothing. The tracks came from the timber to the cabin door. They did not return. Isaac Mercer was not found that winter, or any winter after. The spring thaw of 1846 opened the hollow to the kind of search that deep snow had made impossible, a thorough walking of every drainage and every slope within reasonable distance, the kind of methodical covering of ground that people did when they had hope enough to do it and persistence enough to finish. The search found nothing that could be attributed to Mercer. No remains, no clothing, no equipment. The hollow gave back the winter's snow and the hollow's ground and nothing else. Thomas walked every drainage himself over the course of those spring weeks, separately from the organized search, in the early mornings before the settlement was fully moving. He walked with Ress, who had been willing to go into the timber again once the snow was gone, and he watched her as much as he watched the ground, letting her lead where she wanted to lead, reading her attention the way he read it in the field. She found nothing. She moved through the timber and the creek bottoms with her ordinary working attention, curious and alert, and she showed him nothing that indicated a find. He walked past the site of Cole's cabin on the north drainage one morning in April. The cabin had been gone for years, burned or fallen, only the stone foundation remaining, the clearing around it grown in with brush and young timber. He stood at the foundation and looked at the space where the cabin had been and thought about 1831 and about Doyle, standing where he was standing, 30 years younger, looking at a broken latch and a perfect snow. He thought, this hollow has two of these. He thought, Cole in 1831 and Mercer in 1846. 15 years apart. Same conditions, same evidence, same absence of an account. He thought, there may be others before Cole that nobody recorded. He stood at the old foundation for a while, and then he went back down the drainage. The tracks in the snow around Mercer's cabin were the last physical evidence the hollow produced. The wind that had revealed them continued, and over the following days the drifting snow covered them again, and by the time the temperature rose enough to soften the surface, the tracks were gone. Thomas had described them to the best of his ability, and Matthew Doyle had described them, and Will had described them, and the descriptions were consistent with each other, and inconsistent with any animal track that any of the three could name with confidence. The impressions were too large for a man, and too deliberate for any animal Thomas had tracked in 15 years of ridge country trapping. He had tracked bear and elk and cougar and everything the hollow country produced, and the impressions did not match any of them in the specific way that a skilled tracker meant when he said a track did not match a thing. Not the failure of a partial match, but the positive evidence of something outside the category. He wrote this in his journal, which he kept for trapping records and weather observations and the practical notes of a man managing a livelihood in difficult terrain. He wrote, the tracks came from the north timber and stopped at the threshold. They did not match any animal I know. The impressions were larger than a man's boot and broader, with an edge quality I cannot describe precisely. He wrote, I have looked at these impressions from every angle, and I cannot name what made them. He wrote, I do not think this is a failure of knowledge. I think it is the evidence being honest about what it shows. He wrote, I will think about this for a long time. He was right about that. The cabin stood for 2 more years before the settlement decided it was not going to be claimed and began using its timber for other purposes. Thomas was the one who went to take the door for a repair project in the spring of 1848, and he stood in the open doorway of the empty cabin and looked at the cold hearth and the empty rifle pegs. Someone had taken the rifle in the first year, a practical decision about a good tool going unused, and the bare floor where the boots had been. He thought about what Doyle had said, about hearing something and opening the door for it. He thought about what it would sound like, what it would have to sound like on a winter night with 3 feet of snow and the hollow silent in the specific silence of deep cold, to make a man get out of bed and break the bar on his door. He could not construct the sound. He had tried, across the 2 years since the morning he had walked up to the open door, to imagine what he would hear that would make him do what Mercer appeared to have done, and he could not make the imagination work. He could not find the sound. He thought, I have been in this hollow for 9 years. I have slept in a barred cabin through hundreds of winter nights with the hollow quiet around me and the timber close. I have heard the sounds those nights produced. The wind in the ridge timber, the creek running low and cold, the settling sounds of a cabin in hard cold, the occasional noise from the tree line that I identified and filed in the category of things I knew. He thought, none of those sounds would make me break my own latch, which did not mean there was no sound that would. It meant he hadn't heard it. He took the door and went back to his cabin. For the rest of that winter, the winter of 1846, The winter of the 3-foot snow, and the open door, and the tracks that came from the timber and did not return. No one in the hollow slept with their cabin door unbarred, not because they were afraid of what might come in from the woods. That fear they could have managed. The Ozark Hollow country in 1846 had things in the woods that came toward cabins at night, and the settlers knew those things and knew how to think about them, and the rifle on the wall was the management of that fear. A known thing in the dark was a manageable thing. You barred the door, and you kept the rifle loaded, and you understood the terms of what you were dealing with. What they could not manage was the other possibility, the one Doyle had named and then declined, to extend further. The possibility that Mercer had not been taken, or frightened, or forced. The possibility that Mercer had heard something in the winter night and had decided, in whatever state a man was in when he made such a decision, to open the door for it. That was the possibility that kept the bars on the doors, because a bar kept out what was outside, and no one had ever fully accounted for how Mercer had gone.